So I asked the people I interviewed, well, what was the other parent saying about you? What was the bad thing? And when you boil it down, because there's all these different variations, but when you boil it down, there's only 3 things that the alienating parent is telling the child. And this is important for targeted parents to know, because you've got to be the opposite of these 3 things, all right? And it's unsafe, unloving, and unavailable. It's always a variation of one of those 3. Unsafe, unloving, unavailable.
What if you're all 3?
Well, that too. You mean, what if you're being told you're all 3? Right. Yes, and it is often all 3. I'm not saying the alienating parent says, which of the 3 do I want to, they're intuitive in doing this. It's not like they're reading a manual on how to be an alienating parent and then selecting, I'm going to do that one. They just know, from an attachment point of view, what is a good parent? A parent who's safe and loving and available. So intuitively, these alienating parents know how to undermine the child's sense of security with that other parent. All right, so the second strategy, and I'm not going to belabor all of these because I know we don't have time. Actually, I'm just going to see. It's 9:30 and we end at 10. All right. There's no way I'm going to get through all of this. So the second one is limiting contact. This is also very, 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 very common, and it can range from coming 15 minutes early for pickups every Saturday morning to moving away and not giving the other parent, forwarding address and phone number. But the point of the limiting contact is many-fold. Okay, the first one is there's less opportunity for the targeted parent to show him or herself to be loving and safe and available if they actually have less time together. All right, the other thing that it accomplishes, it acclimates the child to spending less time with that parent. As one targeted parent said, I'm being eclipsed, sort of slowly disappeared, right? And it gets the child used to not spending time, and their whole life becomes the alienating parent's home and family and friends and way of doing things, and it becomes sort of weird or unusual to be with that other parent, right? Okay, so that's limiting contact. The third one is interfering with communication. All right, so when parents or children are separated, typically there's some form of communication, whether it's letters, cell phones, text messages, IMs, it's like endless now, right? And alienating parents are sort of, very comfortable limiting communication between the targeted parent. When the kid is with the targeted parent, they want 100% easy open access, right? They're going to call morning, noon, and night and keep the kid on the phone the whole time. But when the child is with them, they're hanging up the phone, right? They see the number come up and they let it go to the message, and then they don't even play the message for the kid. They don't say, oh, here, Johnny, here's a letter, from your dad. They throw out the mail. I can't tell you, so many of the people I interviewed found letters that had been sent to them or were given letters. One man I interviewed, his father, when the man was 40, when I interviewed him, his father tracked him down, hired a private detective, tracked him down, and gave him his 7-year-old birthday card that had been returned, and he saved it. And it said, return to sender, not here, we don't want you, go drop dead, whatever the envelope said. He saved the whole thing, and he could finally give it to his son, who was then 40. All right. So the fourth one is interfering with symbolic communication. So not only do kids need actual communication, talking on the phone or reading letters when there's a separation, but they need symbolic communication, meaning thinking about that other parent, talking about that parent, and looking at photographs. And we know from research, even with very young children, that to help children stay close, have a loving feeling towards that parent, to help them manage the anxiety of the separation, they need to talk about that parent and have a picture, right? I mean, every parent who sends their kid off to kindergarten knows, you give your kid a little, your scarf or a photograph of you, and it helps them manage that separation. Well, alienating parents are very clear that the kid is not allowed to talk about and say the name of the targeted parent, and there are certainly no photographs of the targeted parent in the alienating parent's house. So it's like erasing the kid. It's like the Iron Curtain, right? The kid walks into that home and the targeted parent does not exist. Nobody says that person's name, there's no photographs, they're gone. And the kid is given the message, you are not allowed to think about and have feelings about that other parent. Okay, withdrawal of love. So if the child shows any positive feelings towards the targeted parent or wants to talk about that parent, the alienating parent will withdraw their love and emotional connectedness, and then the child becomes consumed with anxiety. Oh my God, I'm losing this person. And so they willingly give up talking about or thinking about or looking at a photograph of the targeted parent in order to reestablish that connection. And the people I interviewed talked repeatedly about being given the cold shoulder when they came home from visits with the targeted parent. One person said that she was always given a smaller portion of dinner when she would go visit the other parent. Like the message was, you know, I am really not happy with you. You're going to get the little lamb chop for dinner. One person said he was treated like a traitor, like the enemy. One person said the alienating parent didn't talk to him for 24 hours when he came home from visiting the targeted parent. Okay. I'm going to skip 6 and 7. They're sort of self-evident. Asking the child, I'm going to talk about 11 and 12 for a moment. Asking the child to spy on the targeted parent and to keep secrets from that parent not only is sort of morally wrong, right, to teach a child to disrespect the parental authority of the targeted parent, but it creates guilt and shame inside the child. They've done something wrong to that parent, and that makes them want to avoid that parent even more. So it's sort of, some of these strategies are like, you know, I like to think of alienating parents as like evil geniuses. Like they get a lot of bang for their buck in their behavior. They sort of kind of keep nailing that coffin shut, but, you know, the relationship of the child with the other parent. Referring to the targeted parent by first name, think back to that letter, I hate Kevin, I hate Kevin, I hate Kevin, I hate Kevin. It's a way of saying that person isn't my parent anymore. They're not worthy of, you know, of respect. They're not a person of authority over me. I don't belong to them. It's very powerful. And it's very humiliating for the targeted parent to all of a sudden have your child call you by your first name. And you can bet the kid isn't calling the alienating parent by the first name, right? Referring to the step-parent as mom. You know, these step-parents sort of parade around, you know, to the schools and the doctors, and they sort of just step in and pretend that they're the parent, and it's another way of wiping out and marginalizing the targeted parent. Not including, you know, not cluing the targeted parent into what's happening in the child's life, keeping the targeted parent's name off of school records. I hear this over and over and over again. It's sort of just an erasing of the targeted parent from the life of the child. Changing the child's name. I know this seems like a weird one, but what's the first thing a cult leader does when somebody enters a cult? Change their name. Why? Well, it creates a new identity. You're not that person you used to be. You belong to me now. And that's the same thing. Now, moms do it by using their maiden name as the child's last name. Dads do it in other slightly more creative ways, coming up with a new nickname. Now, you know, well, we always called you Jimmy, right? That's your new name. And then the child sort of associates his Jimmy-ness with his new life with dad, and maybe his name used to be James for the first 10 years of his life, and that was that old person. So it's a very effective strategy, and it tells the world sort of who the child belongs to. All right, I'm not going to belabor this anymore. All right, every time. All right. I want to talk a little bit about cults. I've sort of indicated that there's this analogy. Chapter 2 of my book is called The Cult of Parenthood. This is almost a spot-on, perfect analogy that alienating parents create a cult-like atmosphere. They use the same strategies that cult leaders use. I don't think they're reading books on how to be a cult leader. I think they just know intuitively how to emotionally manipulate their children, how to create dependency on them. That's the core of being in a cult is you give all your, you give up your self-sufficiency, your independent thinking, your critical thinking, and you become wholly dependent on this other person, even when it goes against your own best interest, right? Every time? I have to do this twice? Okay. The cult analogy is useful because the people that I interviewed felt like, gee, I'm the only person in the world who was so stupid, to walk away from my loving dad and just because my horrible abusive mom told me to, right? And they had no way of talking about it. Now, hopefully with this conference, and maybe we'll get the word out about parental alienation, but until it's widely talked about, the cult analogy helps people understand, and one of the things I say, I don't know if you read the Star newspaper article, but I gave this quote in there, no adult wakes up and says, today's the day. I've just decided I'm going to shave my head. I'm going to give away all my money. I'm going to cut off my friends and family and quit my job, move out of my home. I'm going to move into a commune. I'll probably not eat enough or get enough sleep. And I really want to stand in an airport for 15 hours a day selling flowers for nickels so some stranger can have a Mercedes. That's my life plan, right? Nobody says that. And yet it happens, right? Because the person's critical thinking skills are slowly eroded. Well, if it can happen to an adult who's going against their own best interest for a total stranger, it can certainly happen for a child with their own parent. And when you talk to alienated kids, it helps them understand how they made this decision, right? Because many, many, many people end up in cults. It's also helpful, I'm going to jump to point 3, because we know something about how people recover from cults, and we can apply that knowledge to alienated kids. Okay, and the truism of what we know about cults is leaving the cult is just the beginning of recovery. You do not say, gee, I was 18 and I moved into a cult for 10 years and now I'm a 28-year-old adult with no life skills and no critical thinking skills and no ability to take care of myself, but I'm out of the cult, so it's all good. Right? It doesn't work like that. Leaving the cult is just the beginning. There's a whole recovery process. And interviews with former cult members show that the cult thinking, that cult member, leader, is still in their head. If you ask somebody who left a cult, how are you doing or what's going on? They'll say, well, I think the cult leader can read my mind. He's very disappointed and angry. He knows I've disrespected him, right? They still have that fear that the cult leader is omnipotent and omniscient, right? Well, we know the same thing for alienated kids. You don't just wake up one day and say, oh, I cut off my father for 20 years and had no relationship, and I allied myself with this abusive mom. But it's good. I'm done. I figured it out, so I'm okay now, right? There's a recovery process, and we can apply what we know about cults to how alienated kids are going to recover. It's also useful because we know a lot about the long-term effects of being in a cult, because people have been doing therapy and interviewing former cult members. And no surprise, when I interviewed the adults and said, well, what did this do to you? What do you think the long-term effects of being an alienated child have been for you? With one exception, the outcomes were exactly the same. Come on. Okay. The first thing they talked about was low self-esteem. I'm a horrible person. I hate myself. I can't tell you how many of the people I interviewed said this. They felt such enormous shame and disappointment in themselves. And of course, they had low self-esteem because their self-sufficiency had been undermined. The alienating parent isn't saying, think for yourself and make your own decisions, right? The message of the alienating parent is, I know what's best, and I'm the boss of you, and you better do what I say. And so even when they grow up, and even if they figure it out, they really don't have a sense that they know who they are and that they can trust themselves. Depression, 70-something% of the people said they were depressed. And one woman said, I'm not sure what you call it, but I'm so sad I can't get out of bed. I said, well, I call that depression, right? And I think of my understanding of why they were depressed is not just that they had this tremendous loss in their life. And think about all those losses I talked about of the parent and the loss of all the extended family, and the loss of themselves. But what we know about loss is that it leads to depression if you don't have the opportunity to mourn the thing that you lost or the parent that you lost. And that's the one thing that alienated kids can't do. They're not allowed to say, I miss dad, or I wish I could see mom, right? They're forbidden. Remember, one of the strategies is they're not allowed to talk about or think about that parent. So they have this tremendous loss. One parent is just wiped out or ripped out of their life, and then they have no chance to make sense out of it. And the story that comes to my mind about that is Robin, who when he was, I think he was 7, came home from school one day, and there was a man, a stranger. He didn't know who this was in his living room. And his mother said, well, this is your new dad. This is Daddy. And Robin said, well, what happened to the man who used to be my father? So he already intuitively knew he wasn't allowed to refer to him as my father anymore. He was getting a message, that person isn't your father. So he said, what happened to the man who used to be my father? And the mom said, oh, he was a bad, horrible man. Meanwhile, of course, the new dad was an alcoholic, drunk who beat him. But that's beside the point. The old daddy was bad, and that was it. From that point on, Robin was not allowed to even use the word father to talk about that man who had been his father for the first 7 years of his life. All right, so that's what leads to depression, is an inability to make meaning of the loss. The people I interviewed, not surprisingly, had enormously high rates of divorce. They also talked about drug abuse, which they turned to deal with all of this incredible shame and pain and depression. And I want to just talk for a moment about the 7th one, what I call the intergenerational cycle of PAS. Half the people that I interviewed who were parents, some of them hadn't been parents yet or were never parents, but half the people who were parents had already lost their own kids to parental alienation. And a lot of times when I talk about this, people say, but wait a minute, don't alienated kids grow up to be alienating parents? But it's the other way around. At least in my research, what I found is alienated kids grow up to be targeted parents. And a sort of classic example, but it's not the only one, is a young boy who has a narcissistic mother. And I didn't even talk about personality disorders, but maybe, I don't think I'll even have time. But anyway, a young boy has a narcissistic mother who turns him against the father, right? So that's the original PAS. This boy grows up. Who does he marry? A narcissistic woman, right? That's all he knows. That's a woman to him. That's love. That's a relationship. And then when that marriage ended in divorce, as I said, we had very high rates of divorce. What does that woman do to him? She turns the kids against him, right? Okay, so those are the 7 long-term effects. Okay, I'm going to skip this because I know I'm really running late here. Can I go over a little bit since we started? Okay, but you'll tell me, stop? Okay. All right, so what? Midnight Madness. Just keep going. Okay. We've been talking a lot today. I've heard a lot about PAS as a form of child abuse, and I think we all believe that, but I wanted to just sort of dig a little bit deeper into that. And the first thing is, almost everybody I interviewed spontaneously used that phrase. I was abused, I was mistreated, I was emotionally abused, I was emotionally neglected as a child. They all sort of felt that was their experience. But what I did was I took a classic definition of emotional abuse. This one has 7 components, and it was created by APSAC, the American Professional Society on Abuse of Children. And then I went back and I looked at the behaviors of the alienating parent and found that, lo and behold, alienating parents use many of these behaviors. And so it's not a surprise that the children felt rejected and ignored and isolated and terrorized and corrupted and spurned and verbally assaulted. And I don't think that's any big surprise to us, but it's helpful to look at this classic definition of emotional abuse and see that it really does line up with the behaviors of the alienating parent. And again, I think it's helpful because alienating parents often justify their behavior by saying, well, I'm protecting the child, and it's just because I love my child so much. But in fact, they are doing things that are creating in their child a feeling of being abused. All right? Goodness. Can you help me? Because it's not working. Thank you. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the realization process. All 40 people I interviewed did, in fact, have this realization process. It was not an epiphany except for 2 people. So 38 of the people talked about it as a process, a slow awakening. It wasn't like they just woke up one day and said, oh, yeah, okay, I got it wrong. It's not this one, but it's that one who's really the good parent. It just didn't work that way. And there's a great quote from a book written by some former cult members who were talking about, well, how did they come to the realization that this cult leader really didn't have their best interest at heart? They had devoted themselves, wholeheartedly to this cult. How did they finally come out of it? And, the quote is something like, well, I put all the doubts I had in a little box on a shelf in the back of my mind. So it's sort of like in a box on a shelf, it's back there, it's sort of not really open to exploration. And then the woman said, but eventually the shelf got so heavy it broke. So that was like the best metaphor that she could come up with. There were these little seeds of doubt, and then there was just an accumulation, a slow process, and finally a breakthrough, an ability to rethink the past. But this was a very painful realization for the people that I interviewed. None of them said, yeah, I'm so glad I figured out that I've been lied to my whole life and I treated that parent so badly. That's a really good thing to know. They were happy to know the truth and to reconnect with the parts of themselves that they had given up. But it was very painful to realize that a parent that they had allied with had misused their trust in that parent and had, in fact, abused them. And for many of the people I interviewed, there was tremendous guilt over what they had done to the targeted parent. When they could finally take in that they had broken that parent's heart, it was horrible for them. And when they were finally able to say, that parent that I said I wanted nothing to do with and didn't have anything to do with for 5 years or 10 years or 40 years, whatever it was, you know what, that was a mistake. I would have been better to have a relationship with that parent. They all said, I'm glad I reconnected. I feel really close to that parent now, if in fact they did, but nothing can make up for that time. And Robin, who got his 7-year-old birthday card from his dad at age 40, he wept. He was so happy to know that his daddy loved him and wanted him to have a birthday card. But there's no time machine to take him back to age 7 when he was waiting for that card. Did Daddy remember my birthday? And not to have that card. Nothing can undo that. Okay. So what I found when I asked them, well, how did you come to this realization? Remember, that was question 2 of my study when I was telling you the 3 overarching questions. Question 2 was, how did you come to the realization? Well, there's sort of good news and bad news here. There's a lot of different things. It wasn't the case that everybody said, oh, well, it was this, oh, it was this, oh, it was this, so we know that it's one thing. There's a lot of different possible catalysts. For one person, it was having a child and saying, gee, my child deserves 2 parents, I deserve 2 parents. For another person, it was the death of the alienating parent, where they could say, now that I don't have to worry about disappointing that person, I'm sort of curious, actually, about that other parent. For another one, it was becoming a targeted parent, him or herself, and saying, oh, my ex is doing to me, maybe that's what my parent did. So it's not one thing. There's no magic wand or silver bullet. I see it as good news or bad news. There's a lot of ways for kids to have that realization, but we don't know what realization is going to work for this kid versus that kid. And it's even a little more complicated because two people had the same experience, say the death of an alienating parent, and for one, it entrenched her further in the alienation. She actually took her father, the targeted parent, to court to keep him away from her younger sibling. She picked up the mantle of the alienating mother. And for another one, the death of the alienating parent was the thing that freed him or her up to finally pursue a relationship. So we don't know what catalyst is going to work for what person. Oh, I think I want to go back for a second, if I can. Okay, so here are some of the different catalysts that I identified. For one, it was just maturation. The woman said, it wasn't any one thing, it was just time. I saw how other parents talk to each other. I saw my friends grow up and be parents. I grew up. Some of them just couldn't pinpoint it. It was just, I just had enough separation from the alienating parent. I was growing up. I was just able to tolerate that person being mad at me so that I could venture out and see what that targeted parent was like. A fairly common one was the alienating parent turning on the child. This is a rude awakening. These kids think they're like precious trophies that everybody's fighting over, right? And they feel like they are just the most important people in the world, right? Because everybody wants them. But the minute they ally themselves fully with the alienating parent, in some cases, this alienating parent turns on the child and starts abusing and controlling them because these parents, remember the cartoon at the beginning, if it's not the kids, it's the cats? These parents just need somebody to sort of mistreat and control. And if they turn on the alienated child, in some cases, the kid was like, you know what? I don't like how this feels. I'm not so sure I made the right choice. I might check out that other parent again. Okay, and I mentioned the other ones already, so I'm going to move on. Oh, I just wanted to mention therapy. That was the bottom of the last list. None of them went into therapy to work on this. In fact, one woman said she went into therapy to work on something else, and the therapist said, oh, tell me about your parents. And she said, well, I'm the luckiest person. I'm one of those people whose parents' divorce didn't affect her at all. She had no clue. And then the therapist was like, really? Not at all? And then, after months or years, she finally had her breakthrough, her realization. Okay. Since I know we're running out of time, I do want to get to this part. Now, my advice for targeted parents is written out in a lot more detail in a little paper I have on my website called Beyond the High Road, all right? And the reason I called it that is because, so I'm just going to give you a little flavor now, but the reason I call it Beyond the High Road is because targeted parents get into this trap. They say, my ex is doing all these things, that bad-mouthing and limiting contact and interfering with communication, right? Check, 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 check. They're doing all these things, but I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to take the high road because I don't want to be like that alienating parent because then it's like, I'm not going to do tit for tat because if I think it's wrong for that parent to do it, I'm not going to do it. And that's half right. Yes, you shouldn't become an alienating parent yourself. But that doesn't mean that you then do nothing. People seem to think this high road is sort of nothing. It's like a vast emptiness of nothing, no strategies, no response. And what I think happens to targeted parents who take this high road when they think of the high road as doing nothing is that they become one of two things: depressed, because they're constantly demoralized, humiliated, and frustrated. Their contact with their child is chronically interfered with. Their life is incredibly unpredictable because every time they think they're going to get their kid, they don't. Or they go knock on that door thinking they're going to get their kid, and the kid's not there, and they're disappointed and ashamed, and it's just horrible, horrible. Or they become so reactive, and there's a famous movie star. Anybody think of his name? Okay. All right. So, those are sort of the two likely outcomes if you think the high road is doing nothing. All right, so I wrote this paper, Beyond the High Road, and it takes each of the 17 common parental alienation strategies, and it tells targeted parents a different way to react. All right, and I'm just going to give you an example or two, and then I want to go down through the list that's up there. So if your ex is bad-mouthing you, let's take the most common one, what should you do? Well, yeah, you shouldn't bad-mouth the ex, that's true. But that doesn't mean you just bite your tongue and, suffer in silence. What I suggest within reason is to do something like this. And this is just an idea to give targeted parents creative ways of sort of breaking out of this constriction that they think the high road is doing nothing. So one option would be to go to the targeted parent if they're saying something bad about you that you hear and say, gosh, you seem really upset with me. And it helps to say this in front of the kid, because the whole point is not to change the behavior of the alienating parent. They're hopeless, in my opinion. All right? They're not going to listen to reason. The idea is to show your child something about yourself. So you say to the alienating parent, you seem really upset with me. I hear what you're saying. I'm actually a little upset too. I have my own list of complaints about what's going on here. How about if we take this up in mediation or out for coffee or whatever, just list something. It doesn't matter. The parent's not going to take you up on it. They're not going to say, yeah, let's go out for coffee. Oh, that's a great idea. But the point is, you're on the record in front of your child as having your own complaints without actually saying them. So you're not actually bad-mouthing the other parent, right? You're just on the record. And you're sort of standing up to the alienating parent, but in a way that's actually appropriate and mature and possibly even empathic. And like I said, it's not designed to do anything with the alienating parent. It's just to not be a total doormat in front of your child. Okay, so the principles here, when you're interacting with a moderately alienated child, so that's a kid that you still have access to. This wouldn't apply to kids that you don't have any access to, and I'm going to get to that next. But the first thing is, don't take the bait. When your child says, you stole my college money, you don't say, no, I didn't. And if your child says, you're unsafe and you don't love me, you don't scream, I am safe, I do love you. Because what kids remember is the tone of your voice, right? So they don't hear, I'm safe and I love you. They hear screaming, screaming, screaming. Right? So you need to be empathic with your child, because that's the one thing alienating parents can't be, right? If they have a personality disorder, they're not able to really acknowledge the separate existence and separate experience of the child, so you can show yourself to be different and say to your child, wow, you think I stole your college money? You must be so hurt. All right, so your first job is to be empathic with your child. And then you can say, of course, I have my own side. And when you're ready or when you're older, we can talk about that. But you don't go run and get the bank statement and wave it in their eyes. They're not going to look at it. And you don't scream and argue with your child, because all they're going to do is say, gee, mom's such a drag. All she does is fight with me. So it's how you are. And then go back to that bad-mouthing message about you're unsafe and unloving and unavailable. So you need to be safe and loving and available. It almost doesn't matter what you say. It's how you are with your child. And that's what targeted parents forget, because they're so frustrated at being maligned and being sort of cornered and being lied about that they just want to convince their child. But that's not how you convince your child, through strength and anger. You convince them through loving empathy. And there's strength in actually being able to tolerate that attitude of your child. I don't mean accept it, but not, try to smash them down with your response. And as I said earlier, don't take it personally. Your child is saying the most nasty, horrible, disgusting, hurtful things to you. But just think, this is the alienating message. This is my spouse talking through my child. My child's just a puppet. You can't say that to your child. Nobody wants to be told they're a puppet. But it helps you to know that your child is just, think about the kid I told you whose mother wrote her scripts, okay? Your child's just doing a script because that's what your child needs to do right now. You can't hate your child. And I think targeted parents, because their child's hurting them, It's hard to stay in that suspended animation of wanting this love. So in a way, it's easy to hate your child because that sort of gets you out of wanting them. But they're suffering too, and it's important to remember that. And that's why separate the message from the messenger. The messenger is your child. They're just bringing this message. You have to still love your child. Okay. I think I mentioned this already, have empathy. This is a terrible thing for a child to go through. You know, allying with the parent in a way is a solution for the child. To pick one parent and reject the other sort of gets them out of this state of tension that they're in. So it's a solution for them in the short run. I'm not saying accept it because it's not good for them in the long run. But you can sort of understand why a child would want to say, okay, I'm going to pick this one and let go of that one. As I said earlier, be different than the message. Really think about it. What is your ex saying about you? What is that message? Try to really be attuned to it and then try to be different from that. Number 7, this is hard. Always show up. You know, your ex can call and say, don't even bother coming Sunday, you know, or Friday for your regular pickup. We're not going to be there. You need to be there. Okay, you need to show your child and be there every single time. I mean, unless the court changes the order and whatever. But, you know, that, for one thing, it can be a trap, right? That can be the one time the kid is sitting there on the doorstep with the bag packed and you don't show up and then it looks like you don't care. So you have to always do the right thing. And I actually want to belabor that for a little bit because targeted parents always say, or often say, it's so unfair. That alienating parent gets to bend and break all the rules. They don't show up. They don't give me my kid when I'm supposed to. They do this. They take my name off the school forms and on, you know, go down that list of strategies. And the court doesn't do anything. And I do one little thing wrong, and I'm like back in court, you know, having to defend myself. And the answer is, you're right. Alienating parents do seem to get away with it, don't they? And I did a study of targeted parents, and I asked them, and this was all about their legal issues, and I said to them, well, when all was said and done in court, and you finally had a court order, were your rights as they were outlined in the order enforced? And what do you think? 95% said no. And so I called that paper, even when you win, you lose, right? Because even when everything goes right, which doesn't always happen, right? Where the lawyer actually cares and the judge gets it and the evaluator's onto it and blah, blah, blah. And you get that order, it sort of doesn't matter anyway because alienating parents sort of get away with everything. And it's totally unfair. But that's the reality of this horrible situation. And targeted parents still need to hold themselves to a higher standard. They don't get to, put their fist through the wall in frustration in front of the alienating parent or scream at their kid. They have to hold themselves to a totally different standard. And it is unfair, but that's the reality. And the final ones, of course, get lots of support. Being a targeted parent is a horrible thing. And every targeted parent I've ever spoken to feels like they're the only one and nobody could possibly understand. And in a way, if you haven't gone through it, you probably can't understand it. So I do encourage targeted parents to get lots of support. And I also just have a little bit of advice before I end for people who have no contact with their kids. And this is also just very, very sad. But there are people who come to me and say, I haven't seen my kid in 10 years or 6 months or whatever it is. It's too long, right, to go any period of time where you haven't seen your kid. And, the first thing is never give up hope. That is certainly the message of my book. The people I interviewed said, I treated that parent badly, but I never wanted that parent to go away. I didn't really understand what it meant to say to my parent, drop dead or don't come back. I didn't know that they would never come back, right? So that's why you don't take it personally and you keep coming back. And they said, I always missed that parent and I'm so grateful that that parent kept at it and kept fighting for me and kept calling me. They don't want you to give up on them no matter what they say. Leave a trail of breadcrumbs, that just means always let your child know where you are. You know, not the kind of breadcrumbs that get eaten by the birds in the house on ground. Good breadcrumbs that just stay there. So your kid always knows, you know, if you move or you get a new phone number, make sure your kid knows. You know, I basically tell targeted parents who haven't had contact with their kids, you should be texting or emailing or IMing your child every week, every single week. Just, hello, I love you, I'm thinking about you, my heart is open, my house is open, my arms are open, I want to see you. No questions asked. Open invitation. You need to keep letting your kid know. Some of the people I interviewed didn't reconnect with their targeted parent because they were worried that person would be angry at them. Because that person didn't read my book, that parent, and didn't know. Keep letting your kid know. Week in and week out. I love you. I want to see with you. I want to see you. And you know, I want to give you this other breadcrumb metaphor. I seem to be fixated on that. But targeted parents often say like, well, if I just send this little text message to my child, it's just a crumb. It's just nothing. You know, I want to give them so much. I have like a whole loaf of love to give my child, and this is just a little crumb I'm just putting out there. It just feels like it just couldn't possibly be enough or mean anything. And it's so hard for me to, you know, send out that little message because it just activates all my yearning and my love for that child. And I say to that parent, from your perspective, that message of love is a crumb because you have so much love as a parent to give to that child. But from the child, that crumb is a loaf. It's everything because it's the difference between knowing that parent loves you and wants you back and not knowing that. And you have to see it from the child's perspective.
And they would maybe charge the parent if they were to contact them even by email. So
I'm not sure I followed. I'm sorry.
If I'm the child and I get an email from my parent, I'm so angry with them that I would charge them if they emailed me.
You know what?
It's harassment.
Oh, charge. I thought you meant
Charge.
money.
No.
Well, okay. I mean, if you are told by the court, do not contact this child, then obviously my advice wouldn't apply. So, but it's...
How would you make contact then?
If you were told by the court, you mean you're just sort of worried that you're going to be charged with harassment? I don't, you know, you could find out what the harassment laws are, but I don't think sending somebody an email once a week is harassment. But, you know, find out what it is and be within those limits.
I had all my cards returned with a note saying if you continue to try and contact me, I'll file harassment.
Right. Then I wouldn't do it. But what... Right. But what I would do under those circumstances, when you were told, you know, do not, and first of all, many people say to me, I send emails every week and I never hear back. And I say, well, is your email blocked? Does it come back? No. Then keep doing it, right? But if it does come back, do not send me another letter. I would say you have to respect that, but you could set up a website. You know, it doesn't cost much anymore to have a website with just pictures of you, and you make sure that legally everything is appropriate, right? But that way your child can know if they ever want to, or just have a Facebook thing, because, right, they could just find you that way. Make sure that there's some way that they can find you if they want to. Okay?
Say something more about being creative and keeping in touch.
Well, just people sort of get stuck, like, you know, they just always send an email, but they sort of forget, well, it should be a text message one week and a card one week, and sort of mix it up. And, you know, certainly in terms of emails, I know this is very sort of mundane and practical, but think very carefully about what is in the header of the email, because the kid might just delete, delete, delete if they see it's a message from you, but subliminally they might be getting something. So it shouldn't say something like update or checking in, right? It could say, love from your mother, or your father's thinking of you. Something that's, you know, a loving message that you're putting out there, because it will, you know, if the message the kid is getting is, you know, that the targeted parent doesn't love them and walked away from them, you're countering that by at least putting out that message. So I just wanted to end with where I think the action's going to be for dealing with this issue, all right? I don't think it's in changing the behaviors of alienating parents. I think even if you said to an alienating parent, 20 years from now, your kid's going to hate you, they wouldn't change what they're doing today, right? They have a totally closed system. The information is not going to change their behavior. I think we need to educate and empower targeted parents, and that's where some of my advice is heading. I think the real action right now, in my mind, what I'm thinking is getting to the kids before they're alienated and giving them the critical thinking skills so that they can resist the pressure to choose. All right, because it's the critical, when they give up their critical thinking skills, when they stop questioning what they're being told, and they wholesale buy in to that negativity about the targeted parent, you're sort of sunk. So we have to get to the kids before those critical thinking skills are undermined, and we need to shore that up. And so I've written this little book with Catherine Andre, a clinical psychologist out in California who treats a lot of alienated kids. The book is called I Don't Want to Choose: How Middle School Kids Can Avoid Choosing One Parent Over the Other. And my goal is to develop a program to take to schools, because although targeted parents can buy this book and give it to their kids, and maybe if you still have enough of a relationship with your kid that it would work, but I think it would be even better if we could get neutral third-party authorities like teachers and school guidance counselors and school social workers and therapists and mediators and all of that, if they could give this book to the kids routinely, every kid whose parent's divorcing, I think we could help hopefully break this cycle. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.